Why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? At the time when the first bombers and fighters of the Imperial Japanese Navy appeared in the skies over Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on the early morning of December 7, 1941, tensions between Japan and the United States had been escalating for nearly a decade, making a war between the two countries seemingly inevitable. When the Japanese planes began their assault, the American military was completely caught off guard and unprepared for such a large-scale attack. This attack significantly altered the military situation of World War II, especially in the Pacific region. However, the underlying causes of the Pearl Harbor bombing can be found in the deepening conflicts of interest between Japan and the United States in the preceding decade. Tensions begin during the Great Depression. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, tensions between the Empire of Japan and the United States had been steadily increasing for nearly a decade. Japan, an island nation that had been largely isolated from the rest of the world for much of its history, began a period of aggressive military expansion in the early 20th century. Two major military victories against the Qing dynasty of China in the First Sino-Japanese War, 1894 to 1895, and the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905, fueled Japan's ambitions for dominance. Additionally, Japan's successful participation as part of the Allied powers in World War I, 1914 to 1918, further fueled its military ambitions. During the global Great Depression in the 1930s, Japan sought to address its economic and population problems by invading China. This began in 1931 with Japan's invasion and occupation of Manchuria, China. When the Lytton Commission, established by the League of Nations, condemned this act of aggression, Japan withdrew from the international organization and continued to occupy Manchuria until 1945. In July 1937, a military clash between Japanese and Chinese forces at the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing led to the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War. In December 1937, after the Japanese captured Nanjing, the then capital of the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek, they carried out a 6-week-long massacre of civilians, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and becoming one of Japan's most brutal war crimes, known as the Nanjing Massacre. The United States attempts to curb Japan's global expansion. In response to Japan's brutal actions in China, such as the Nanjing Massacre, the United States began imposing economic sanctions on Japan. Specifically, the government issued trade embargoes, halting the export of key goods to Japan, such as airplanes, oil, scrap metal, and other strategic materials. At the same time, the U.S. increased financial and military support for the Nationalist Party forces led by Chiang Kai-shek in order to counter Japanese expansion in China and Asia. In September 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, two fascist powers at the time engaged in war with the Allied countries. Japan's alliance with the Axis powers further strained the Japan-US relationship. The governments of Japan and the United States had been negotiating for months prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor, but failed to reach any agreement. Meanwhile, the U.S. hoped that economic sanctions, including the embargo on oil and other essential supplies, would force Japan to end its military aggression. However, the punitive measures and pressure from the West only fueled anger among the Japanese government and people. They believed that war with the U.S. was the only way to protect their country's imperial status. Due to the escalating tension and deadlock in negotiations, Japan realized that their only opportunity was to launch a surprise attack to shock and confuse the enemy. This led to the decision to attack Pearl Harbor without prior warning. Objective: Pacific control. In May 1940, the United States chose Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu, part of the Hawaiian Islands, as the main strategic naval base of the Pacific Fleet. Due to the low assessment of Japan's ability to directly attack Hawaii, which is nearly 4,000 miles away from mainland Japan, the Americans did not fully deploy a defense system at Pearl Harbor. This made this key naval base an easy target for attack. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, spent several months planning a surprise attack to destroy the majority of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The objective was to break the fighting spirit of the U.S. Navy, preventing them from stopping the Japanese advance into strategic areas across the Pacific. The surprise attack by the Imperial Japanese Navy on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, on the morning of December 7, 1941, pushed the United States out of isolation and officially into World War II. This brutal war would end with Japan's unconditional surrender after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. Initially, the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor seemed like a major military victory for Japan. Japanese bombers and fighters hit all 8 battleships of the U.S. Navy at the harbor, sinking 4 and heavily damaging 4 others. Over 300 U.S. aircraft were destroyed or severely damaged. The U.S. casualties reached nearly 2,500 dead or missing. After the victory at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese military continued to occupy several former European colonies in Southeast Asia. By early 1942, they had taken control of Burma, Myanmar, Malaysia, and Singapore, British territories, Indonesia, Dutch territory, and the Philippines. This allowed Japan to control the abundant natural resources of the region, such as oil, rubber, and tin. However, the objective of completely destroying the U.S. Pacific Fleet in the Pearl Harbor attack was not achieved. Japanese aircraft missed key targets such as fuel depots, ammunition warehouses, and ship repair yards. Furthermore, no U.S. aircraft carriers were present at Pearl Harbor during the attack. This failure would haunt Japan as the U.S. Navy achieved a decisive victory in the Battle of Midway in June 1942, turning the tide of the war in the Pacific. Impact on the Pacific theater of World War II. In July 1937, a military clash between Japanese and Chinese forces at the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing led to the outbreak of the Second Sino-Japanese War. In December 1937, after the Japanese army captured Nanjing, the then capital of the nationalist government led by Chiang Kai-shek, they carried out prolonged massacres of civilians over 6 weeks, taking the lives of hundreds of thousands of people and becoming one of the most brutal war crimes of Japan, known as the Nanjing Massacre. The Battle of Pearl Harbor also caused a strong wave of unity and patriotism within the United States. This greatly supported the war effort of the United States, from enhancing military production to easier recruitment of soldiers. For Japan, in the short term, Pearl Harbor was considered a strategic victory, but in the long run, it forced them to face a powerful and technologically advanced United States military. Additionally, this event also encouraged Allied nations to strengthen their fighting efforts against the Japanese Imperial Army.